How cool should I put on in history?
Okay, please everybody mute yourself. So welcome everybody. My name is Carol Stern, as you probably know, and I'm a librarian here at the Glen Cove Public Library. Before we begin, I just want you to save the date, Tuesday, May 17th, 7 o'clock. It's not 2 o'clock, it's 7 o'clock at night. The author of the Berlin Apartment, Rin Turnbull, will be here virtually. It's another great book, so mark your calendars and you can sign up on our webpage and I'll send out an email. So now I'm thrilled to introduce Laura Spence-Ash. Laura's fiction has appeared in One Story, New England Review, Crazy Horse, and elsewhere. Her critical essays and book reviews appear regularly in the Plowshare blog. She received an MFA in fiction from Rutgers, Newark, and lives in New Jersey. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll get them at the end of the discussion, and we can open it up to everybody if you would like. To minimize distractions, please keep yourself muted during the discussion. So Laura, congratulations on a beautiful novel. I'm so glad you're here today. I just love this book. It was, I was just telling Laura before she came on, I didn't really hear about this book, and when I read it, I said it was one of my favorite books. You have such a wonderful way with words. It was great. So could you talk about your background a little, what inspired you to pursue writing and how you got started?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's so great to see so many people at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's wonderful. So yes, in terms of my background, I wrote in college many years ago and thought that's what I was going to do. I moved to New York after college and thought I'd get a job in publishing and then I'd write the next great American novel. But it was the early 80s and it was a recession, as some of us may remember, and jobs were not so easy to come by. I ended up working in a bank for a couple of years, and then I actually went and got an MBA at NYU. And my life took obviously a very different turn. I worked in finance and marketing, mostly for television. And then my kids came along in the 90s. I was home with them for a while. And then I went to work for Princeton in administrative capacities. But all during that time, writing was this thing back here, which I think a lot of us have, right? That thing that we really want to do. And we keep telling ourselves, one day I'm going to get back to that thing. And I didn't, and I didn't, and I didn't. And then my father died in 2007, kind of unexpectedly. And that was very much, as I think, again, it is for a lot of people, that was very much a wake-up call for me of like, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And the answer to that, when I asked myself that question, was I want to write. I want to go back to that thing I said I wanted to do. So the summer after he died, actually, the summer of 2008, I went, there are a number of these summer writing workshop conferences around the country, around the world, but around the country. And I went to one that summer and I studied with the writer Ann Packer. And it was such a marvelous experience. I loved her. I loved the whole community that I was entering into. And I just loved it. And I came home after that summer saying, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write. And, you know, I sort of did, but then life, as it does, got in the way. I have 2 kids and full-time job, et cetera, et cetera. So it sort of petered off. And then my mother died 5 years later in 2012. And again, I did the same thing. I went to one of these summer writing conferences, took a week and went and did this. And this time I did it in New York. And I did it, the conference was run by a literary journal called One Story. And they ended up publishing my first story. They published the story that I workshopped that summer about 6 months later. And that was the beginning of everything for me because they gave me the confidence that I needed to apply to MFA programs, which was also something I'd always wanted to do. And I heard from agents after publishing the story. I mean, it was really being like shot out of a cannon. And it was so, so wonderful. I am indebted to them forever for publishing that story. And so I quit my job at Princeton and I went and did this MFA program at Rutgers for 2 years full time. I taught while I was there, so that was wonderful as well. And I even further got sort of into this community of writers, which is really a wonderful, wonderful place to live. I had thought a little bit about this novel earlier, before I sort of returned to writing. In 1998, I'd read an article in the New York Times about a group of older British adults who came back to the States to see where they had been during the war. And they were in Tuxedo Park, New York. And their story is actually really fascinating because there was an empty house in Tuxedo Park. So this group of children came over together and they were all placed in this house in Tuxedo Park. And the village kind of came together and they hired people from the village to sort of cook for them and take care of them and educate them. And so they were all together during the years that they were in the States before they went back to Europe. So their story is quite unique, but I had no idea that this was a thing, right? That children were sent as far afield as the States. And the numbers vary, but it seems like somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people were sent children were sent to the US and Canada during that time. And for whatever reason, and I think we don't always know what these things are that make us remember them and think about them and obsess over them, but I could not stop thinking about this. And partly it was that my children were young at the time when I read that. And I couldn't imagine doing what these parents had done of putting my children on a ship by themselves and sending them across the Atlantic. And I also couldn't quite imagine being on the receiving end either. What is it like to take a child into your home and change your family perhaps forever by doing that? So I just kept thinking about it. I wasn't writing at the time, but I just kept thinking about it and I kept reading whatever I could find. And I'd sort of started to create some characters in my head. And then I read a memoir by a man who had been sent with his brother to a town south of Boston. And it turned out completely coincidentally that he had been sent to the same town where I went to high school, because I went to boarding school at a place south of Boston, and he was living in the same town and he attended the same school I did, but he was there as a day student and I was there as a boarder, and I was there much later than he was. But it was the first time I'd been away from home. And so I sort of knew that place, and I knew being in that place and feeling homesick and feeling like a fish out of water. And so almost immediately I had this place, and everything else grew out of that because I then set beyond that the sea in that town, even though it's never named in the novel. And so everything else grew out of that. I started it before I started the MFA, probably around 2008, 2009, in fits and starts, and years of it being like 100 pages done and put in a drawer for a long, long period of time. And then after the MFA, when I came back to it, I sort of wrestled with it a little bit again. And then I set about writing it, and basically in the format it is now, with all those points of view. For many years, I thought I would just have a single point of view, or I'd have maybe 3 points of view. But I finally decided that it was really a novel about family, and I wanted to hear from everybody in both families. And once I started writing it with those shorter chapters, with all those points of view, that's when it felt right to me. And that's when I continued and actually got to the end, which I'd never gotten to the end before. Yeah, so that's sort of the story of both how I came back to writing and how the novel took shape.
So how long did it actually take you to write this book? You said it was a long time. I mean,
so if I started in 2008 and I didn't, I started querying agents in February of 20, which in hindsight was not a good moment to be querying agents, but I didn't know that at the time. But yeah, so it was, a solid 10, 11 years.
so how did you do the research once you got the idea for this story? How did you do the research for the book?
So I did a fair bit of research early on in that, 2008, 2009, about the Blitz, about London. I was in London a few times, so I was able to go to the War Museum. There were a number of online sort of chat places where some of the many of the now adults, then children who had been sent away would sort of talk about their experiences. So I got to read a lot of that stuff. Most of the children in London who were sent away were sent to the country. And I think we all know about that. That's what Narnia is, right? Those kids were sent to their uncles in the country because of the Blitz. It's a very, very small percentage that were sent farther afield. But I was able to, glean some of that information. P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins, she actually has a novel about escorting some children to the United States. And so I was able to read that, which was based on her experience. She actually acted as an escort for some children of family friends. So I sort of gathered bits and pieces, but most of it was based in that early time. And that was as I was writing, I sort of kept rewriting the 40s, like kind of again and again and again. And it wasn't until the final year of writing that I actually was in the 50s and the 60s. And so at that time, my research was more sort of a deep dive. I would get to a certain year and a certain place, and I'd sort of do a deep dive of research to kind of figure out the time and the place before moving on. So it sort of varied depending on where I was in the process.
It really is a difficult decision for a parent to do such a thing, as you stated at the beginning. Can you talk about Reginald, about the decision to send B away? I mean, his thought process and stuff?
I think, having lived through the First War, I think he had a sense of what was coming, and he knew how it had affected him, and he didn't want that to affect his child. And he saw this as a way of providing safety for her, right? As we all do want for our children. I think, he obviously had no idea that he would never see her again, right? And so had he known that, things would have been different perhaps, but I think he was very determined that safety was first for him, and that's what he wanted for her.
And that's what he wanted. That's so interesting. It's so funny. In World War II, my father, my grandparents were from Germany, and they sent, when they were not allowed to go to school anymore, people, and not allowed to work in Germany, my grandparents sent my father to a boarding school in London, in England, for 5 years. And, looking back, it was a good decision. In the book, looking back, she lost touch with her mother, sort of like that. Can you talk about that relationship between the two mothers and the impact that it has on a child?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was fascinating, right? And to think about how those 5 years in particular, right? Those early teenage years are so important. And if you're not with your mother and you're with this other person that's sort of standing in, what does that do long term? And that was always my interest here, was seeing how this decision would sort of affect all these lives over a long period of time. It's not just a blip and you kind of get back to your life and everything is as it was before. This is something that's going to stay with all these people in both families for the rest of time. And when I first started out, I think the two mothers were they are very different, but I think they were even more different. And I struggled actually writing Millie because I think I was judging her. I was judging her for her anger and her, the way that she treated Bea when Bea got back, that she didn't want to know anything about the Gregorys and she just wanted to erase that. But I think the more time I spent with her, the more I could understand perhaps that rage and that jealousy and that need to kind of erase that section because she wanted Bea back for herself. And I found it really fascinating, and it's so complex. And so I think over time, I grew to admire her and I stopped judging her as much. And so she kind of softened around the edges for me too, a little bit.
Right, that was a hard decision. I mean, and she didn't want to send Bea away, right?
Right. She did not want to send Bea away. And that's basically where the book begins, right? We learn that was not her choice and that it was Reginald's choice. And yet, that was never completely conveyed to Bea. So I thought that was an interesting thing too, that there would be this kind of hidden thing right from the start.
And then what happens when the kid grows up feeling connected more to the other family? That's not easy.
Right. Right. And I certainly have friends in situations like that who have become close to step parents, right? Close and end up being closer to a step parent than they are to their biological parent. And how does that affect them? How does that affect their families? How does that affect their children? Right. Again, this idea of reverberations is fascinating to me.
So you have a lot of different points of view in as you said at the beginning. How did you navigate so many points of view? Can you talk about that?
So it was really fun to write it in these short chapters with all these points of view. And part of it is that I had spent the years when I was in the MFA writing short stories. Most MFA programs focus on the short story. So I was pretty comfortable writing a short story. A novel feels so enormous. You can't sort of hold it in your hands the way you can hold a short story in your hands. And I found it very intimidating. And I think that was what was happening all those years before the MFA was I really didn't know how to do this thing of writing a novel. I got out of my MFA. I still didn't know how to write a novel, felt a little more confident with my writing ability, perhaps. And so by deciding to do all these points of view and having these very short chapters, it almost was a trick that it was almost felt like a little short story, each chapter, right? I didn't even think of them as chapters, actually. I thought of them as moments. That for each of these characters, we just get a few pages of a moment in time, and they're not memories because the first section and the third section are all written in the present tense. So they're not looking back. They're actually experiencing the moment in real time, and the reader is doing that along with them. I sort of saw them as memories in the making. But I could easily, well, maybe not always, not so easily, but I could write one in a day. And that felt very satisfying. I would always then start the next one before I left my writing desk for the day. So I would figure out which character was going to come next and when in time we were going to be, because we were always moving forward in time. And I'd get at least a sentence or two down so that I was never coming back to a blank page. So that helped too, because I wasn't sitting down then the next day and having to make choices. Like I'd already made those choices. So then I could just start writing. And it just grew incrementally. When I was writing it in this format, I was taking a year-long novel writing class that was just wonderful. And we had pages due. We had like 50 pages, then 150, then another 150 over the course of the year. And so I kind of backed into what do I need to write every week to sort of hit those goals. And I kept myself to that schedule. I had a spreadsheet and I looked at that spreadsheet every day to make sure that I was staying on top of the project. And that's how I got it done. So actually it was easy to do the points of view because it was this trick of like kind of tricking me into thinking I was just writing these little things that were then stringing together to create this larger work.
So there were eight narrators basically. So did you outline ahead like before the book started, or as you go, you created new characters?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I knew the characters in both families because the earlier versions, one version, again, I never got to the end, but one version just had B narrating. And then in another version, I had B narrating the 40s, William narrating the 50s, and Gerald narrating the 60s. So I'd gotten there, but then when I decided that I really wanted to include everyone, I did not outline. I knew generally that there would be those three sections, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. I knew that I wanted the center section, which is just William and B, and just a few days to feel and look very, very different than the other two sections. I knew that ahead of time. And I knew I wanted to go. I'm a very symmetrical person, so I knew if it was going to be 40 to 45 in the first section, that it would have to be 60 to 65 in the third section. But other than that, I really did not know where it was going. I tend not to outline whenever I've tried to do that. For me, anyway, it totally it just takes the freshness out, and it feels really pre-planned, and I don't like that feeling. I'm much more comfortable kind of coming upon things the same way the reader does. I like to kind of think of myself as the reader discovering these things. So that works for me much better. I know so many writers I know are the opposite, like they actually know the ending before they start, and their process is figuring out how they're going to get to that end. But that is not the way I work.
So William, you mentioned William. Was he a difficult character to write? Because I thought he was sort of depressed.
Yeah, he was very difficult, in part because I am not like that. And I certainly have known people like that, though, people who seem to have been given everything in their lives and yet can't seem to kind of make a go of it as an adult, right? And that they seem to have sort of peaked in high school or something. And so it was difficult to write him, but at the same time, it was really fascinating because I was trying to understand him. I was trying to figure out who he was and why he made the decisions he did. And so that was interesting to write, but it was frustrating. I would say he was probably the hardest character to write out of all of them.
Who was the easiest and who was your favorite?
So B probably is the easiest because I'd been with her the longest, because I had started with just her point of view. And I really thought at the beginning that this was her book. Now I really think it's kind of everybody's book. But I think she's probably closest to my heart. I also love Rose, and Rose was a little bit of a risk perhaps, because she's not really part of, I mean, she's sort of part of the Gregory's, but you know, it's always kind of difficult to introduce a character later in a novel and have them stick. But I was so fascinated by her. I loved her arc. I love the idea of these women coming of age in the 60s and sort of navigating that split between, you know, the world before the 60s and the world after, and thinking about them career-wise. And I really enjoyed her. I loved her Kennedy obsession. It was really fun to write her. So I enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, I liked her too. She was a good character. And she was such a good add-on at the end, towards the end of the novel. So water and sea are strong symbols in the book. How do they reflect themes like emotional depth, the passage of time, or the possibility of renewal? And can you talk about why the sea symbolizes Bee's emotional journey?
Yeah, the sea was really important to me from the beginning. As I said, the house outside Boston is based in a real town, but everything that's in Maine is totally fictional. I love Maine, but I wanted them to be on an island. Like that just felt to me metaphorically where I wanted them to be. I wanted the sea to be all the way around them. I wanted that family to be together on that island. I wanted Bee to have that experience, because it's sort of and then the sea being this large thing that is in between the two families for all that time. It's not like today where we can jump on a plane, right? It was much more difficult to navigate the sea at that time. So I really wanted the sea to be a big part of it, but it wasn't, interestingly, it wasn't called Beyond That the Sea for most of its life. But when but I've always loved the quote by Virginia Woolf, which is where that line comes from. And when I decided to call it that, it was wonderful. It shows what a good title I think can do. It really called attention to that, and it made me go back through the book and sort of push the sea up in terms of just making sure that we were always thinking about the sea throughout the book, that we're always thinking about it was this thing, this thing in the world that was separating these two families. And so that was really fun to explore and to think about.
That's how you got the title.
I got the title from the Wolf quote, which I can read actually, because I do love it. Find it. So in the beginning, there was the nursery with windows opening onto a garden, and beyond that, the sea. And it's from The Waves, Virginia Woolf. I think I first read this in college. And I just love that line, because to me, that's sort of the description of a life, right? In the beginning, there was the nursery with windows opening onto a garden, and beyond that, the sea. You just get this sense of a life unfurling. And when I got to the end and realized that for each of these characters, we really do see, their lives, or the section of the lives that we get to see. And it just felt, that quote felt perfect for this book. And then the fact that beyond that, the sea was the end of that line just felt wonderful. I didn't use it. I found it, but I didn't use it for a long time because I thought it was maybe a little too vague, a little too esoteric. I was worried that they would take it away from me, but nobody, my agent, my editor, nobody ever said anything in terms of that. So I was so thankful that we were able to keep that as the title.
Yeah, that's good. So that was your first title and that stuck. And what about the cover of the book? I mean, it represents both sides of the Atlantic, and the artwork. Can you talk about that? Was that
Yeah,
the original cover and design, or?
Yeah, I actually got the mock-up of the cover before I even got edits on the novel from my editor. They do, at this house, they do their covers very, very early. And it basically looked like it does now. There were no planes in the sky, though. Right now there are planes between Beyond and that. And then a few months later, they had a sales meeting and they came, and I liked the title. I liked the cover, what they had done. I like the fact that this woman is not really identifiable. She's not identifiable both in terms of where she is, right? It could be she's in the States looking east. It could be she's in England looking west, right? It's not really clear whether this is the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. And so I liked that universality of it. I thought that worked really well. And I also thought it had a nice sense of yearning, right? That you kind of got from this image, this sense of longing and yearning, which I think runs through the novel. But a few months after this, they had a sales meeting and they came back with a slightly different cover. The woman was different. She was very clearly a woman from the 1940s, dressed. I mean, she is still dressed in that sort of green that we identify with the 1940s, but it was even more so. Her hair was redder and it was like a little more like permed, I think. And the planes were there. And so I actually pushed back on that, even though I probably didn't have a leg to stand on, but I just said that I didn't know. Oh, and her hair was red. And I said, I don't know who this is on the cover of the book. And, you took away this sort of universality that I really liked in the original. And why are there planes there? Because if this is, Maine or Massachusetts, I don't think there'd be planes there. And so they were willing to go back to the original woman, which is now who's here. They were not willing to let go of the planes because that, for their marketing ideas, I think signals, and I think if you look at a lot of these World War II books that are out, you will see those planes in the sky. It signals that it's a World War II book to people, or at least a war book. And so they were not willing to let go of that. But I've made my peace with it. But yeah, so that's the story of the cover.
Well, I have to now look at I was just looking at when I looked at it, I was just looking at the girl looking into the ocean, thinking of the symbolism of that. Now you mentioned the planes and I see it.
Right.
I do. So the ending of the Beyond That, the Sea, it seems to leave some questions unanswered. Was this intentional, or are the open-ended conclusions? Or can you talk about that a little? And I'm assuming most people read the book, so.
Yes. So first of all, when we were talking about whether I outlined or not, and I was saying I needed the 40s and the 60s to be symmetrical, I always thought it would just end at 65. But I got to the end of 65 and I still had some questions. And so I decided to jump forward and do the epilogue, jumping forward to 77. I wanted to answer some questions, but I didn't want to answer all of the questions because those are my favorite kind of books to read. Ones that enough is tied up that I feel closure, but there's still stuff to think about and there's still things left open just to ponder. And I really like that. So that's what I tried to do here. The big thing I think that's left open is that perhaps the marriage is started with an untruth. And is that the way we should start marriages? And And I think, I personally like that. I like that complexity of thinking about this relationship and thinking why B did that, and how, it seems through to 77, like everything is okay built on that, but is it? I don't know. But I definitely did that intentionally.
So there were a lot of secrets and lies driven throughout the narrative. Can you talk about how you did that and what your intentions were with that?
I mean, there's sort of nothing better for a fiction writer than secrets and lies, because part of it is you can let the reader in on some of it, so the reader is kind of sometimes knows the secret and lie, and sometimes the reader doesn't, right? So there's this fun thing to do as a writer to kind of play with that dynamic. And I think it's also very pervasive in our lives, right? I think there are all sorts of secrets and lies that we all have. And so it's an interesting thing to explore. I think, so much of fiction is just exploring human nature, and certainly secrets and lies are a big part of that. So yes, that's why those are sort of woven throughout. And they were also, once I got to the end, the wonderful thing about editing is that you get to go back to the beginning and you get to make all this stuff, everything stronger by making sure that the threads are throughout. So when I got to the end and realized that there was this quite important lie being told towards the end, I could go back to the beginning and make sure that there were secrets and lies woven throughout, so that when we got there, it's not a total surprise because we've already seen a bunch of secrets and lies throughout.
And I think memory also played. People's memories and the interpretations of their memories was another important part of it.
Right. I think, I was really intent on having it all be in present tense, or the first section and the third section, because I didn't want the idea of memory to kind of overshadow, I didn't want them always thinking about, is this how I remembered this thing, or was it some other way, or to have conflicting memories. I wanted them for the reader to be in the present with the characters. In the middle section, that is written in past tense, and there we see a little bit more of how both William and B, I think, how they remember things. And I did that intentionally because I wanted them to be thinking about that as they were together. And also the thought that for the two of them, because that is yet another secret, those days that they spend together in London, that this was a story they would tell themselves for the rest of their lives, right? About those few days, because they're the only ones that know what happened during those days. And so memory definitely plays a part there. And that's partially why that section is in the past tense, because it's thinking about the relationship between the past and the present.
It's interesting. Yeah, good. So I have a question. Part of the dialogue in the novel is in italics in the middle of the paragraphs, being offset by quotes. This is a little unconventional, I think. Why did you make this decision, and how did it fit into your themes? Like, why did you do this?
So yeah, the italics are used in the first and third sections when it's in present tense. And I actually, originally it wasn't even in italics. And that was where somebody said, you need to put it in italics because it's too difficult to discern what's dialogue and what's not if you don't do that. So some of this came from, while I was in my MFA, I wrote a short story that was two characters over 30 years. And it just pinged back and forth between this couple over these 30 years periods. And so because it was a short story, but we were moving forward the way we did here, it was just these paragraphs, and it was just these moments as it is here, but even shorter because it was just a paragraph. And I had done the same thing there with the dialogue, thinking that in these moments, dialogue, what one of these characters is saying to the other is just one of the things that's happening. And if we think about the way we usually represent dialogue on the page, it's very highlighted, right? We put quotes around it. We pull it out of the paragraph. There's a lot of white space on the page. There's a lot of attention paid to dialogue. And I didn't want that. I wanted this just something someone said to somebody else just be one of the things that's happening in that moment. So I'd written that short story. I really liked the way that short story came out. And so when I started writing this book in this way, with all these points of view, these shorter chapters, I wanted to try and essentially do the same thing, not highlight the dialogue, because sometimes we don't, in some cases we do get sort of fully developed scenes, and other ones it's very truncated, and sometimes it's just a line or two of dialogue. And so again, I didn't really want to put the emphasis on that. In the middle section, when it's written in past tense and it's just the two characters, I wanted the attention on the dialogue because I thought that both Bea and William, again, would remember these days for the rest of their lives, would absolutely remember what they said to each other. And so I wanted to highlight that. I wanted it pulled out and put quotes around it and the white space and all of that. And also to feel more traditional, because I wanted the fact that they would tell themselves these stories felt sort of like a bedtime, not a bedtime story, but you know what I mean, like just more traditional. And so I wanted it to feel like that. So that's why it's the way it is in both sections.
It was an interesting way to write. It was good. I made the novel good. So are you like any of the characters in the book? Can you relate to any of them by yourself?
Um, not at this point, they probably all have a little bit of me in them. I think that's sort of how it works. But they have now been with me for so long, and they became fully people, really, right? There's a point at which they kind of move from characters to becoming almost people that you feel that you know. And so, probably again, Bea is the closest, but not really. And yeah, I mean, part of the joy for me is creating these characters that are different from me, right? And making sure that they are different from me. I think a lot of writers write very close to themselves, and I actually prefer to have some distance and to really use my imagination and really think about, you know, people and how people behave, and really create these three-dimensional characters.
To talk about how people behave. Was it very hard to write about grief and healing for you? Was it?
I think I always write about grief and healing. I think we actually had this when I was in my MFA. We had a contest at the end of each semester where we had to write a piece that people wouldn't identify as being written by us, right? The idea was to trick everyone else in the workshop. So you were supposed to write very differently than you usually write. And so the first year I did it, I wrote this piece, and I was so proud of myself because I'd used this very different voice, and it really didn't sound like my writing at all. And everyone read it and they were like, oh, it's all about grieving. It's obviously Laura's. So I think it really is in everything I write. I think that's just something I'm interested in, and I think I will probably always write about that.
Have you been approached at all for any TV series or a movie at all? Or
So the way it works, you have to get another, you have a literary agent, but then you have to get a film and TV agent. I have a film and TV agent. She has been working very hard. So far, nothing has panned out, but you never know. We shall see. I mean, I think it would be difficult because you'd have to have two casts. There are lots of locations. It just may be more than anyone wants to take on, but yeah, lots of people have said that they hope one day it'll be made into a movie. We'll see.
I think it would make a good movie or a TV series.
Yeah.
Are you working on anything next? Do you have anything on the horizon?
Yeah, I'm working on something that again is historical, although I don't really think of myself as writing historical fiction. I just think about writing stuff that's set in the past, because I'm more interested, I think, in the characters than in the time. But the thing I'm working on now is would be set in the late 60s and in New York City.
You don't want to tell us a little more?
No.
It sounds intriguing. So is there anything else you want to talk about the book that maybe I didn't touch upon that I should have asked you?
I don't think so. Those were wonderful questions. Thank you.
And I see there's questions there's a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe let me see if there's anything here. Someone's making banana bread. You have to share with all of us. I'm listening to the audio and I'm loving your book. What kind of details did you use to make the reader feel like the time and place and situation felt authentic?
So I do a lot of research by reading newspapers. And that when I was talking about doing those deep dives, when I would get to a new year and a new time and a new place, I find newspapers so wonderful because not only do you learn what's, what's happening in the world at that moment in time, but you also get to read the ads and you get to see what movies people are watching and what kind of clothes they're buying and all those kinds of things. I also love photographs. I looked at just so many photographs of both London during the Blitz, but then also what did Boston look like then? What did New York look like? There are various times when they're in New York. What did that look like? I love all of that kind of stuff. And actually, yeah, so that's really, I think, and for me, it's really important to get out of my own way. And so I try to like learn as much as I can about the time and the place, and then get out of the way so the characters can inhabit that time and place. And then I can sort of see it in front of me and write it. And I hope that that's able to convey that.
I think it did. What role did the socioeconomic differences between the two families play in making Bee feel closer to her American family?
That's a great question. I'm fascinated by class. I think it's just so fascinating, especially at that time when the middle class in the US was starting to become more important. And I think for Bee, it was such a different life, right? It was such a different life, such a different family. It's probably hard for her in the moment to separate the fact that they had more money from just the fact that she was in America and this completely different family. But I really was fascinated by that. I was also fascinated by how Millie dealt with that too, right? That she was really quite jealous of the money they had and the opportunities they had, even though, as with so many things, she didn't really understand. I mean, I don't know that they had that much money, right? There was some inherited wealth, but probably not as much as she thought there was. And so that too, I found really interesting to kind of think about and play with.
They had that home in, was it Maine?
They had the home in Maine, but, I don't think they had a lot of extra money. I mean, he was, Ethan was just working at the school and they were living in a home that was owned by the school, right? So, and then ultimately they had to sell that house in order to pay for Gerald to go to college. So, there wasn't a lot of excess, but it looked like there was from the outside.
Mhm.
I think.
What do you think that the home in Maine symbolized for them, for Bee? Like,
I think for Bee, that's where her sort of her heart was, right? That's when she thought, after she went back to London, when she thought back, that's the home she remembered, was that home. I think it was safety and security and love and all these things. And so that's why it was such a pleasure for me as the writer to actually end up back there at the end, because I think that's partly why I didn't feel like it was done in 65, because maybe I too needed to go back to the island, to that sense of safety and security. And so it was good to get back there at the very end.
so Anna wrote, this was one of our book club picks. We all loved the book. Madeline Levy wrote, this book touched me on so many various levels. I told all my friends to read the book. Oh, this is good. Any idea when your new book will be out? It sounds like something I would enjoy. Anna's.
I am trying to finish it up now, and but then it's still a couple years down the road by the time it all gets out. But I'm working hard. I'm trying to work hard.
Are you still using the same publisher, or do you get new?
We'll see. I don't know yet where it will end up.
I guess that's not so easy, right? I mean,
It all depends. It's really book by book, depending on. I don't have a 2-book contract. I just had a 1-book contract, so it could end up there, but it could also end up someplace else.
So when you were on when the book was first published, I believe you were on the Today Show, and I wrote it down. You were interviewed by by Anna Napolitano, Alice Elliott, and they blurbed about the book. That must have been quite the experience for you.
It was great. I felt so lucky with the blurbs that I got for the book, because I've been now in this writing community for a while. I have a lot of wonderful friends, and Ann Napolitano is one. She actually worked for a while at the literary journal that published my first story, which is called One Story. So I got to know her there. And then while she was, I didn't know this at the time because her book came out, I think, just a week after mine. And that was her book that was chosen, that was Hello Beautiful, that was chosen for Oprah. And I didn't know that at the time. So I actually asked her to do my launch event with me. And she was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I can't do it." And then I found out later that it was because she was the Oprah pick. And so she was a little booked up that month. But I felt very lucky. And then Alice Elliott Dark, whose book Fellowship Point, if you have not read that, I highly, highly, highly encourage everyone to read it. It came out a year before mine. She was my thesis advisor in my MFA. She is a wonderful writer, and the Fellowship Point is about two 80-year-old women who have land and homes in Maine. They live in Philadelphia, and they have to decide, it's inherited also, and they have to decide what they're going to do with it when they die, what they're going to do with that land and their houses. And so the book is really, it's really about their friendship over their lifetimes. They get to know each other when they're younger in Philadelphia. And so you sort of hear through backstory about what happens to their friendship as it sort of ebbs and flows over the years. But really what it is a 19th century novel, like a Jane Austen novel, turned on its head because it's women owning the land and deciding what to do with it rather than men. So it's so clever. It's so wonderfully done. She is a beautiful writer. So I highly, highly recommend that. But yes,
What's it called? Love? What is it called? Love Fellowship?
it's called Fellowship Point.
Okay, I will look into that.
Oh, and you said something, somebody said something about the audiobook. I can talk a little bit about that. So that was really fun because I had no idea this was going to happen. They sent me tapes of 3 people reading excerpts from the book. They were all British. One was an actress. One was, I think, narrates audiobooks. And the third one is actress and an audiobook narrator. And the one who was primarily an actress, it was a very lively reading. And I thought, well, maybe that's good because it's a pretty quiet book. So maybe if it's a very lively reading, that would be great. And then I listened to the one, and the one who did audiobooks it was good, but nothing really stood out for me. And then the one who does both, she has a very quiet tone to her voice, and it was familiar to me. And so I looked up her other books that she had done, and it turned out she did Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell.
That's good.
Hamnet was a book I listened to at the very beginning of the pandemic when we were all sort of like looking for comfort wherever we could find it. And I listened to that every night, and it did bring me comfort. And I loved the tone of her voice, how just soft and perfect it was. And so I ended up going with her, and I think she does a fantastic job with the narration.
So Andrew Schwartz said, what are you reading now?
So there is a wonderful Irish writer named John McGarren, who is considered the Chekhov of Ireland. I had not heard of him until I took a class a couple of years ago with the writer Claire Keegan, and she is very much a devotee of him. And so I decided that this spring I'm going to read all of John McGarren, which isn't actually a lot. He wrote 3 collections of short stories and 6 novels and a memoir. So I felt like I could easily read all that. So that is on my docket. There are a couple of books coming out. Actually, today, what is it called? It has Float in the title by Lynn Steger Strong. That's not the total title. Came out today. It's about a family in Florida, 4 adult siblings going home after their mother has suddenly died and kind of having to deal with each other. I'm sure it's wonderful. All of Lynn's books are really, really great. So I would highly recommend that.
Well, Laura, thank you so much. This was wonderful. You really
Thank
brought your
you.
book, you brought your book to life a lot.
Oh, thank you so much.
Does anybody else have any other questions that they want to ask, or you can unmute yourself? Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you for
And we
coming.
look forward to your next book. I really do.
Okay, thanks so much.
We'll bring you back.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you.